Hello, very good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for spending your Saturday with us. So good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the 7th Liu Kang Annual Lecture. The Liu Kang Annual Lecture series is planned in partnership with the Liu Kang family. And each year, the lecture presents new research that spotlights a pivotal period of Singapore's art history, illuminating the cultural forces and critical moments that have shaped our art. My name is Hui Min, and I'm one of the curators here at the National Gallery Singapore, and I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Gretchen Liu. Gretchen is a historian and independent scholar whose earlier work as a journalist and book editor have always placed her in proximity to visual culture and heritage. Having worked on books relating to Singapore's architectural heritage, as well as the history of photography in Singapore and Malaya, Gretchen's dedication to the work of historical research and documentation continue to inform her current work in uncovering in much greater depth the life and work of her father-in-law, the artist Liu Kang. Her most recent publication, Bali 1952, Through the Lens of Liu Kang, surfaces for the first time a selection of photographs taken by Liu Kang during a trip to Java and Bali with fellow artists from Singapore. Presented alongside corresponding artworks and sketches and a detailed record of their travels, the book provides a fascinating new perspective on the relationship between travel and artistic inspiration in the context of Singapore's art history. Copies of the book are available for purchase today, and Gretchen will be doing a small book signing after the lecture. So coming alongside this new publication is an exhibition at the National Library Singapore, Untold Stories, for Singapore Artists' Quest for Inspiration in Bali 1952. Gretchen's sharing today is also very timely in relation to two ongoing exhibitions at National Gallery Singapore, including City of Others, Asian Artists in Paris, 1920s to 1940s, which features several of Liu's photographs and paintings produced in Paris between 1929 and 1932, and also our long-term exhibition, Singapore Stories, Pathways and Detours in Art, where we have a small display of artworks and archives relating to the 1952 trip. With all this in mind, we've invited Gretchen today to share on the broader place of photography within Liu Kang's artistic practice. After her presentation, Gretchen and I will have a conversation about what unfolds between the moment of encounter and the process of artistic creation, as well as the possibilities that her new research offers. So do keep in mind the questions that you have as we go through today's program, as we'll try to keep some time for that towards the end for an open discussion. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Gretchen Liu. Gretchen, please.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming today to listen to this talk. As Hui Min has said, it's quite an interesting time in Singapore, the study of Singapore's art history with these two exhibitions on, because they illuminate two very important early chapters in Singapore's art history, namely, the French side as well as the impact of the Bali trip. And I thought this afternoon it might be helpful if I just give you a little bit of context as to how it is that I am standing up here in front of you today and telling this story. And that is because obviously Liu Kang is my father-in-law, but I will confess a little bit embarrassingly that while he was alive, I really never probed him on his artistic trajectory. And it was, he passed away in 2004, and there are really three milestones that kind of led me to the point that I am at today. So the first milestone was in 2012, when in 2011-2012, the National Gallery staff organized a retrospective of Liu Kang's paintings that was then at the Old Singapore Art Museum. And I was not involved at all, and the curators uncovered, displayed some early photography. But the real kicker for me was going to Shanghai. And the more often I went, the more curious I got, because the old former French concession, when you're walking down the streets, you can imagine what it was like during the heyday of the city in the 1920s and 30s. And my curiosity really got the better of me, and I thought, I really need to start investigating Liu Kang's early life. And so I took it on as kind of a proper, real subject for research. The second milestone was in 2016. You know, after Liu Kang and my mother-in-law passed away, the house in Katong was lived in by my sister-in-law, Dawson, who's here today. And in 2016, she said that maybe it was time for the house to be cleared out and for her to move on. So I said, I'll help you. And so that was the start of clearing my father-in-law's, his study. He had lots of books and papers and memorabilia and photographs and negatives, and it was all a bit of a jumble. And so we ended up working with the National Library, and we have Go Yu Mei here today, who was involved in the project. And in 2017, we sent 50 boxes of stuff to the National Library. But at the same time, we kept a lot. We kept the things related to his time in Shanghai and France. So it was more things related to his time in Singapore. And then 2020 and COVID. And stuck at home, why not start some projects? So I decided, why don't I actually start to combine like a catalog raisonné of all of Liu Kang's oil paintings. And so I looked at old catalogs. My father-in-law used to photograph his paintings very often. I contacted friends, acquaintances. If you know anybody who has a Liu Kang painting, let me know and just send me an image. It's just to make a record. So his earliest painting is, like 1926 or so, all the way up until the late 1990s. So, and then the second project that I started on was to unpack the Bali story. In 2016, I had found this shoebox that contained forgotten photographs. I won't tell you more now, but that is going to figure in my talk a little later. So without further ado, Hui Min posed a question to me. What was the evolving place of photography vis-a-vis art in Liu Kang's artistic practice? And it's something I had never really thought of. And so I embarked on a new journey of discovery, and I'm going to share with you today what I found out. So basically, you can divide Liu Kang's photography up into two distinct periods. The early photographs kind of are composed of visual diary, where he used photography to keep in touch with family at home and to record his activities. And then there was a turning point, and the turning point definitely is the trip to Bali and Java in 1952, when the use of photography became like the equivalent of a visual sketchbook, something that did not replace sketching, but could kind of complement it, especially in situations where it was not easy to draw or sketch. So I can't assume that you all know about his life. So very briefly, he's born in China in 1911, and he comes to Malaya, to Muar, in 1917 with his mother. His father's already there working. And then he finishes his education there and comes to Singapore. But in 1926, he goes off to Shanghai. He's going to attend a high school there, but he doesn't stay there very long, and he ends up enrolling in an art school. And in 1928, he graduates from the Tsinghua Art Academy, and then he already has a plan to go to Paris. So those are the Paris years. And then even before he leaves Paris, he has an invitation from his friend and mentor, Liu Haisu, to come to Shanghai and teach Western painting in the Shanghai Art Academy or Art College. And then in 1937, Japanese attack Shanghai, and he, newly married, decides to come to Malaya with his wife, and again we'll touch on that a little bit later. So photography as visual diary. So these negatives are almost 100 years old. So Liu Kang would have gotten his camera either at the end of 1925 or early 26 before he left for Shanghai. And this is an amazing photo of his father, young siblings, and the mother in the car. His father was involved in the rubber. They had a small rubber holding, but he was also an administrator for a wealthy uncle who was involved in many more businesses in Muar. But what's particularly interesting is the photograph of his mother. He took a series of these photographs, and you can see that he's given his mother a very interesting composition. She's in, there's a mirror behind her, so you see her back, and with the curtain falling. So already even when he first has his camera, and he was a photographer, mind you, before he was an artist, he is already quite creative in his composition. And so this is what he looks like in Shanghai. He's a teenager. And you can see he's carrying his camera. The weather was cold, it was winter. And very importantly, he carried a tripod with him, which is why there are so many selfies, okay? And here he is this is a scan of an original negative, okay? But the print has a caption on the back, and it says French Garden, which is the Fuxing Park in Shanghai today. And we also found these little envelopes where negatives were kept, and in the bottom one, you can see that there were still original negatives in it when we found it. And here is these photographs. The prints are dated 9th September 1926, and you can see him with two friends. The person on the left is Chen Renhao, his future brother-in-law, and someone with whom he would travel through life with until Renhao's untimely death in 1976. But you can see the Shanghai that they're exploring as young students. It's the modern city. They're from Nanyang, kind of a little bit backward, but Shanghai is the modern metropolis, and they're dressed very handsomely and touring the city. So Liu Kang took a series of photographs on that day, and we can now identify the actual date. So by this time, he had had his first exposure to art education and had just enrolled as a full-time student in the Shanghai Art Academy. He didn't stay there very long, but the reasons are too complicated to explain to you in this talk today. But one very important point, his mother was completely illiterate. So the only way for him to keep in touch with her was to send photographs, write the captions on back, and then someone could read the captions, which is one of the reasons why there's so many photographs he took during this time in Shanghai. So here you see the front of the photograph, you see the back where he's written the caption and the translations. So, in front of window, 1927, working hard under the light, and then still life. So I think this is a very good example of the sorts of images he was sending home to his family. And he always dated things. And you can see here he also mentions the location. But I think this is one of the best. So the caption reads, I didn't show you the back of the card, but the caption reads, "Groaning in bed, a memory, end of spring 1928. So this is interesting because we did find this painting, which is probably one of his earliest paintings, when we kind of cleared up his estate. And then he took this photograph in the classroom, and you can see very clearly, the connection of the photograph and the drapery, and the cloth and so forth. So, but this is not, the photograph is to kind of capture a moment. It's kind of a goofy photograph, as it were, right? But he was also, occasionally there are glimpses of him as a more serious artistic photographer. So the photograph on the left is captioned on the back, "Morning Shanghai," and the one on the right has a lovely caption, "Not too much meaning, learning to photograph." So he's conscious of his own efforts to kind of improve his skill with photography. And then there are some photographs which are very creatively composed. So here he is with friends. Again, this is in this French park, Fuxing Park. And, the reflection in the pool and so forth. And then this is one of my all-time favorites. It's at Sihu in Hangzhou. And over time, I noticed that he liked to take photographs of people sort of from behind, okay? So that's Chen Renhao on the left. Now, here, he has inscribed on the original photograph, this is from the negative, then he's inscribed it to somebody different, and that is Chen Renpin. And who is Chen Renpin? But it is the sister of Chen Renhao and his future wife. And in 1927, he spends a couple of months in Fujian, where the family lives, because of disruptions in Shanghai, if you know your political history. And at the end of this few months, there's sort of an understanding between these young people that they're engaged. So what happens so this is, when my father-in-law did this portrait, he would have been like 17, 18, maybe 17 years old. Okay, So then he's off to France. And, in his oral history, he talks about how his family was very reluctant to allow him to go. But obviously they had the funds to support him because he didn't have a scholarship. Anyway, so now who is he addressing the photos to or sending photos to? He's sending them to Chen Renpin. And many of the photos, again, of his Paris years are inscribed on the back. Ping for keeping or as a memory. Anyway, here he is again with his tripod, his trusty tripod, and he went to Paris with Chen Renhao. Those, the two of them on the right. And okay, now since City of Elders is on, I'm going to take you on a small tour through Paris, courtesy of Liu Kang. The Louvre. Can you spot him? This is kind of like a Where's Waldo. Okay, the Grand Palais, the Pantheon, the Obelisk. Okay? And then there's the Eiffel Tower and the Arc de Triomphe. So he sent these images all back to show his family and his future wife their Paris adventures. Now he lived in two different places, and in between he spent a year in a French lycée in Fontainebleau. The first residence was in the Paris suburb of Fontenay-aux-Roses, and you can see it wasn't too shabby. It was the home of an engineer, and quite elegantly, set up and whatever. And so you can see that in this circumstance, you imbibe sort of French culture and way of life. He stayed the longest in another suburb of Paris called Nugent-sur-Marne, and he stayed in a very large house that was a pension de famille Les Tourelles, the Towers. And he was here for maybe up to 2 years. And you can see he painted the house, as well as, took this lovely photograph of him and Chen Renhao in the very large garden. They had tennis courts. They had, it was quite a very well, very nice place to stay as well. And here's his landlady, Madame Normand, and we found a painting that he did of her and the photograph of her when he was staying there. And this is interesting because I didn't realize until I was preparing this. So, in the City of Others, this watercolor is on display. And you can see the similarity here between the watercolor and the painting, which no longer exists, was maybe cut up or used for something else. But although the one table is square, one table is round, but you can see that there's, similarities, in the composition. So this was kind of a fun thing to stumble across. And also, this watercolor is reproduced as a tea towel in the museum shop. Okay, all right. And then I think my room in Paris is quite well known. But what most people have not seen is a gouache he did, the one on the right. I can't make out if it's him in bed or Chen Renhao in bed. But, the distinctive wallpaper is you can see in all these photographs, the very distinctive wallpaper. Now, one of the other people he was living with was his good friend Fu Lei. Now, you may or may not have heard of him because Fu Lei ended up translating the great French novels into Chinese, and he was a critic, a writer, and a very important cultural figure in early 20th century China. And he's also unfortunately, during the Cultural Revolution, he and his wife were, attacked by Red Guards, and they committed suicide in 1966. But Fu Lei was one of Liu Kang's closest friends. And this is him. Okay. And you can see those that stayed in the pension was a very international group. Now, one of the unusual things that happened was, in 1929, not long after Liu Kang had arrived in Paris, Liu Haisu came to Paris, and he was the principal of the Shanghai Art Academy. And he actually contacted Liu Kang, and he was looking for a place to stay because he was traveling with his wife and young son. And there happened to be rooms in that house. Remember that nice house of the engineer? You saw the pictures earlier. So Liu Haisu, his son and wife, ended up moving into that same house, and they all lived together for maybe like 8-9 months. And Liu Haisu was on an official government mission sponsored by the Chinese government. So he had an entree into a level of society that obviously these young artists did not. So Liu Haisu ended up kind of co-opting both Liu Kang as his photographer and Fu Lei as his translator, and included these young men in his important outings or contacts with important figures in French art society. So these are Liu Kang's portraits. So one of the things that Liu Haisu did was he held a meeting to try to start an artist association. So this is the steps of that engineer's house, and this is the crowd. Everybody's been identified by now. But the photograph that Liu Kang took was sent back to Shanghai and published in one of the art school's magazines. So this was the role that Liu Kang was playing. And then they visited the studio of the sculptor Paul Landowski, Polish-French, who was one of the most famous sculptors working then. He did the many famous statues in Europe and elsewhere in the world. So there's Landowski, okay, and Liu Haisu and his very well-dressed wife, and Fu Lei and Liu Kang in the studio. And here's the other photographs that Liu Kang took. And one of the reasons for the visit was that Landowski had the commission to do the statue of Sun Yat-sen for the Nanjing Memorial. And this is the statue in the studio before it was sent to China. But even more amazing was they visited the home of Paul Gachet fils. Now, Paul Gachet's father was the physician who attended to Vincent van Gogh in the final weeks, months, whatever, of his life. And the father was a friend of many impressionists or artists of that era, Cézanne, so forth, and he had acquired a lot of art. So by the late 20s, the father had passed away, and it was well-known fact that the family had an amazing collection of art by these important artists. But from my reading, I discovered that he was very private, and he hardly let anyone come and look at these paintings. But somehow he let these Chinese artists, this small delegation, come and view the artworks. And Liu Haisu actually wrote about what an amazing experience it was. And so this is some of what they saw. I mean, this might be familiar to fans of Van Gogh. And so certainly that was a very memorable experience for Liu Kang. During his time in Europe, he was able to travel a little bit, and he, again with Liu Haisu and family and Fu Lei, they all went to Switzerland on the shores of Lake Leman. And this is a very lovely trio of photographs that were taken of them all standing with their easels. It was framed as a sketching adventure, a sketching trip. And here's examples of their artwork, of Liu Kang's artwork. And, there's a very specific landscape around the lake. There's mountains, this is Lake Geneva or Lake Lac Leman. So, there's the lake here. You can see it here. And then there's these mountains behind, okay? And then this small village they were staying in, Sangjin Gulf, a lot of homes had red roofs. So you can see the kind of paintings that have survived that Liu Kang did. But what kind of photographs was he taking? Well, here he's, the outing, and also things like swimming and activities. So he wasn't like taking photographs of the scenery and then going back and trying to paint them. No. Okay, the other thing he did is he went to Étretat in northern France. What was the draw of that? Well, many impressionists went there to paint this dramatic scenery of these cliffs. So one of the artists who was particularly enamored with the landscape was Claude Monet. I mean, he painted many paintings of Étretat. And so Chen Renhao and Liu Kang went up. And so one of Liu Kang's Étretat paintings is also in the exhibition, City of Others. And because these are his photographs, but just in case you think the beach is always empty, this is what it looks like. I suppose maybe it was a weekend or whatever. So there was a lot of life on the beach. Okay, so even before he left Paris, he'd already had an invitation from Liu Haisu to go to Shanghai and teach Western art. And here again, now here he is with his tripod, again back in China as a professor at the Shanghai Art Academy. One of his responsibilities was to lead or co-lead the annual spring and autumn sketching trips. And there's some wonderful photographs that were taken on he in his albums of these trips where, you have the students and the faculty, and they're kind of like hanging out and doing silly things. Or this one on the left has been reproduced in China many times. This is Liu Haisu, and you see, he's got his camel coat over his shoulders. Actually, that's Liu Kang right there. And then, but they've got the coolies carrying their canvases. And then, but the other thing that's interesting about these photographs is that there are a lot of women in them. So by the mid-30s, there were quite a lot of women studying in the Shanghai Art Academy, a big jump from, say, a decade earlier. So these are just, so again, he's not taking photos of Chinese scenery and, going back and painting. No, it's all about the lifestyle and documenting adventures and whatever. Okay, because this is what he was painting. So these are two examples of works that he produced in China. The one on the left is in the National Collection, and the one on the right is actually in our house. But it's this kind of thing, it's this is the style that he was painting. And then come 1936, he made a trip to Huangshan. And, Huangshan is this incredibly majestic and unusual and beautiful mountain resort in Anhui. And here is the first time I saw a connection between photography and artwork. So he did take photographs. So you can see this like waterfall in the one on the photo on the left. And then he did a painting of it, which you see on the right. And then here's another example. I don't know where this is one of his pictures of his paintings. I don't know where it is. So, the Huangshan's famous for its trees, its unusual trees. So this is another example of, the photograph and the landscape. And then this one is, okay, he liked, as I mentioned earlier, to take pictures of his paintings. So like this, but you can see this is like that half of the photograph. So this is, I think, one of the first times where you see photography, art, and travel kind of all connected in a very real way. And I think this, I know that this experience for him, because he talked about it subsequently, was very important, powerful, the inspiration that one gets from traveling. All right, but just on the personal side, he's still documenting his life. It's a lovely photograph of my in-laws, the year they were married in 1937. And also he did a series of wonderful photographs of the interior of his apartment. But they didn't live there very long because, of course, in August 37, the Japanese attacked Shanghai and life changed overnight. And they were very lucky to get on a boat a few days after that, a French boat, travel to Southeast Asia, make it back to Moi, and it would be 37 years before they returned to China again. So now we come to the second part, which is photography as a visual sketchbook. And okay, so a very interesting discovery. In 1948, Liu Kang led a school trip, Zhongcheng High field school trip. I thought you'd enjoy this photo. Okay, of them crossing whatever, maybe, I don't know if it's the causeway or not. Maybe the causeway hadn't been repaired after World War II. Anyway, and then you see him, sketching here. And these are in the National Library collection, part of the donation the family made. And then, oh, look, you have a photo of a tin mine. I found the sketch of the tin mine, and you have a painting of a tin mine. So this is now where you begin to see this kind of like connection happening. Maybe the photograph to imprint the larger kind of the image, and then of course he's a very avid sketcher. And here's another one, Batu Caves, where you've got the photograph and you've got the sketch. And I don't know where that painting is or what happened to it, but it's a photo that Liu Kang took a long time ago of that painting. All right, so then we come to Java and Bali. Now let me see if there's anything I forgot to say. Okay. Let me just get to the Bali part. All right. So I think if you want, I'm not going to answer the question, why Bali? If you want to know the answer to that, please go to the National Library exhibition, and you will find out all about it. But they basically traveled for about 7 weeks, and they departed on the 8th of June. And so here's the photo that was taken at Kallang Airport. Liu Kang, just the day before, the 7th of June, went to this very well-known camera shop on North Ridge Road and purchased an expensive Rolleiflex camera for 500 whatever dollars were in. And we found the receipt when we cleaned his study. And we don't know what happened to the camera. He had a Rolleiflex camera in the house, we found, but we checked the serial number, and it was a 1962 version. So the earlier one, the one he bought and took to Bali, we're not sure what happened to that. But, you know, this amazing thing is that he took over 1,000 photographs during the trip to Bali. You know, and what possessed him, I'm not sure. Okay, but obviously he had a premonition, I would say, that this trip was going to be something very special, and indeed it was. And then he took all these photographs, and he kind of forgot about them. And they sat, most of them, in this old Bata shoebox, which in 2016 I pulled out of a cupboard in my father-in-law's study. And it was the color that kind of caught my eye, that kind of salmony, it kind of glowed at the back of this cupboard. And of course, you imagine how stunned I was when I opened the box and I took out, you know, a pink envelope and a brown envelope, and I found that the pink envelopes had photographs that were like contact size, you know, 6 by 6 centimeter, which is the size of the Rolleiflex negative. And then the brown envelopes contained the original negatives. So what did I do? I kind of packed it away and I brought it back to our house for better climate control. And it was only when COVID started that I took the box out and started to look seriously at the photographs again. So Liu Kang was very liberal in his use of film. So here he is, okay, just as an example. Early, you know, they spent a week in Jakarta organizing their plan, because they landed without a plan, okay? They were relying on people to advise them and help them make arrangements, travel arrangements. So someone told them, oh, you must go and see this every day in the afternoon, you know, the neighbors in this area go and bathe and wash their clothes in this canal. So they went along, and of course it's very awkward to sketch. And I don't know how, you know, we don't know how long they were there. So instead, Liu Kang put his camera to good use, and he took actually 24 photographs of this scene. But he never painted anything, but you can see he was quite fascinated by the movement and I like the composition of his photographs. You know, I think in these you kind of see his eye. All right, another place where it's quite interesting to kind of look at is when they got to Bali, they based themselves in Denpasar. And so you can see here in these photos on the right, Liu Kang kind of just found a corner, an inconspicuous corner somewhere on this street, and just let the world pass by, and he snapped away, you know, as to whatever came. And I think he was, my impression is he's particularly fascinated by women carrying things on their head, okay? So, yeah, so I think he really was fascinated by what I would call the drama of everyday life. They also did sightseeing. They had a week of kind of intensive sightseeing, mostly in the south and the east. And here you see, he took 17 photographs of Besaki Temple, the mother temple, but he also did a series of wonderful sketches of the dramatic landscape of Mount Agong and the temple kind of nestling into that dramatic landscape. Now, this is hitherto unknown is that when they were in Bali, they had two kind of artists in residence periods. And the most significant one is the 1 week they had with what they call Liu Kang, she dubbed her boss lady. Now, Nika Tut-Ranong was a well-known dancer, a very good friend of Ni Polak, Le Mayer's wife. And interestingly enough, she had just performed in Singapore earlier in 1952. So maybe she was kind of predisposed to helping these Singapore artists. But it was Le Mayer who and Ni Polak who facilitated the connection. And here you see, I kind of think this must have been after their week there. So she arranged for like neighborhood girls to come and then created scenarios for them to sketch and photograph. So one of them was assembling the offering. Now, eventually, all of the artists, I mean, all four of our artists did drawings or paintings where there's some connection with this offering, okay? Either being made or in full. So this is just one of Liu Kang's paintings from that scenario. Another scenario was a Jangir dancer. And so you see Liu Kang's painting Suri, and then he took a series of photographs of this young woman, you know, in different poses, pounding rice. So in the early 50s, women were still doing it a traditional way where you take that long pole and you just beat it down, okay? And so you see he sketches and draws. Now, I'm going to draw your attention to this person here. His name is Liu Ming, and he's a Chinese artist who was traveling in Southeast Asia in the late 40s and early 50s. And he bumped in, the four artists, our four Singapore artists, bumped into him in Jakarta at the start of their trip. And he decided, he said, hey, I want to join you. So he went to Bali with them. And so you'll see him in photographs. Anyway, and then not enough time to say anything else at this moment, but just, so there was in Bali a fifth member of this sketching adventure. All right, and here's just a few more examples now of how the connection between, painting, sketching, and photography in Bali. So this is a woman with a traditional boiling rice pot. Ni Polak, so all of the artists did portraits of her. Liu Kang was quite taken with her. They met Le Maire, who invited them for lunch, and it was he was very warm to them. Why? Because Liu Kang could speak French, and Le Maire's Belgian, and he is a French-speaking Belgian. So he was very helpful to them. He also invited them to come back to watch one of the entertainments that the couple put on. It was a commercial venture. So, you could, I don't know, buy a ticket or whatever, and you could go, and there would be a meal prepared, and then there would be a dance performance. And here you see Ni Polak doing her dance with a fan, and Liu Kang's pastel of that scene. Okay, Denpasar Market, very lively market. Again, he took a whole lot of photographs of market scenes, also did sketches, and ultimately he produced this painting of a market scene in Bali. Crossing the strait, so they actually had, it's kind of like a road trip, a guy's road trip, right? But one of the memorable, but not in the best way, moments was when they had to cross the Bali Strait in this tiny craft. And it was okay when they left the coast of Java. It's about 2.5 hours across. But in the middle, the waters got very rough, and they were quite frightened. And Liu Kang wrote about this, okay? But they made it. But they were all quite taken with the boatman. And I don't know where that painting is, but he did a painting, okay? And that's his sketch. And I'm going to show, yeah. So, and also just simple things like Satay Cellar. Again, I don't know where the painting is, but you can see, what he saw, how he drew it, and then what the end result is. Okay, and then we have Minding the Ducks and Masks, where he must have been inspired by this, probably curio shop, and he sketches and he creates that. And this is interesting because you can see, okay, this figure here is from here, and then this, you can see, is very much the path here. And of course, that's a real scene. So here he's kind of drawing elements, different elements he's seen, and putting them together in his painting. And of course, the most famous example of that is Artist and Model, which has now been kind of demystified in that these are sketches of Chen Wenxi and photographs of Chen Wenxi in a town or an area called Tretz out near Surabaya, where they spent a few days before they went to Bali. And then he did the sketch separately of this person, the woman with this, and then eventually he composed this painting. So it's I end this session with this photograph because I can't show you very many photographs. There's no time today. But what really strikes me about this, now this is when they're doing their sightseeing, is when you look at the faces, I think you can really see a sense of satisfaction. So on the left is Chung Soo Ping, then Chen Wenxi, and then Liu Ming, and then Liu Kang. So the Bali experience was, very important for all of them in one way or another. So beyond Bali, what happened is he does bring cameras, and you can see that he still does a lot of sketching. But again, there's moments when it's not possible to sketch or when there's too much going on. Like in Bali, I think maybe they suffered from overstimulation. So here's an example of from Langkawi, a trip to Langkawi in '62. And then he went on the 10-Man art group tour in 1968. And he photographed these women in their costume, and he did this large painting of two women. He also did fruit sellers, and based on what he had seen in this market. So this is all East Malaysia. And then this one, Dayak woman and carrier. And then this is just, I think a lovely, we don't, ink, Chinese ink on paper, and the scene. Okay, in 71, he goes to India, again on a group trip with other Singapore artists, and he took this photograph. Interestingly, this painting is dated 1997, and it could very well be that he actually painted this in the early 70s. But what Liu Kang often did is, if he took an old painting out and he kind of adjusted it or freshened it up, he would then redate the painting, which makes it sometimes very confusing for people. Okay, and another example, this is, musicians, but you can see there's the photograph, there's the sketches. So again, all of this stimulation is going through his mind, and he's, creating artwork. And this is the last example I'm going to show you, Girls of Nepal. All right. Oh, no, finally, of course, I told you, finally after 37 years, he went back to China, traveled quite extensively in 74, 79, 85, 87, and he did quite a few paintings of Huangshan. He had a big trip there in 1987 with Liu Haisu, who was then, in his 90s. And just to show you, so here again, there's a connection between his art and his life experience, the photography, and so on. And then finally, we go back to Bali. Now, this is dated like 1991. So this is from an early trip. But you can see that he was contemplating how he had the idea of doing a painting. But was it going to be a solo figure, something more like a larger composition? Okay. But then in the end, he chose to do just the single figure with Girl with a Fan. All right. So my concluding remarks, I would say that, as mentioned at the beginning, really, initially photography acted as a visual diary. He was taking snapshots as a way of keeping in touch with his family. But at the same time, he took photography seriously. And then from 52 onward, 52 was really a turning point. I think he had the revelation that photography could augment sketching, and especially when traveling, because, the sensory input is so amazing. And I think one thing about Liu Kang, I remember him as always being somebody who I would describe as youthful. He had a very youthful outlook, very positive outlook on life. And I think that photography almost became a habit, but it was almost like a compulsive urge. He loved learning new things, going new places. And I think often it was just, the joy of looking through the lens and capturing those moments that really inspired his photography. And I leave, so I'm not an art historian. I've presented various elements, and maybe it's up to you to conclude the connection between the art and the photography. So, Hui Min, without further ado. Oh, I forgot to say one important thing, because so I was somewhere in Europe and looking in an art museum, and this sentence really stuck out, and I wrote it in my little notebook. When painters and sculptors, draw each other, whatever, they affirm the significance of their own role in society. And in several talks, I've mentioned that for me, when I think of the trip to Bali, maybe one of the most important aspects of it was how, given the success of the exhibition the following year, how affirmative it was to their sense of being artists in the context of Singapore at that time. Okay.
Hey, thank you so much, Gretchen. I think that was, so engaging, and we were just chatting before the discussion, and talking about how strong the visuals really were. So I think today, having worked with Gretchen for past couple months preparing for this, it's always been so wonderful to have conversations with her, and myself as a curator, working here in the National Gallery, thinking about all the new research that can actually come forth through this amazing access that the publication actually provides, having that opportunity to actually look at the photographs. And it's not just photographs, right, which are in the book. She's also included paintings and sketches, not just from Liu Kang, but from the other artists who are on the trip as well. So you can really start to think very deeply in this comparative context as well. So just by way of framing the conversation, kind of brief conversation that we'll have, I think some of the new potential areas of inquiry, for ourselves at the National Gallery, but I hope for other scholars as well, you're really thinking about that comparison between the photographic and painterly gaze. I think it's something really interesting to contemplate. Even that line, right, between photography as a tool for documentation and as a medium for artistic expression, I think is something which is also really kind of interesting to think about. And also the concept of photography as a visual diary, which Gretchen brought up, and what that means for artists who, in particular, have an interest in representational painting, which, for someone like Liu Kang, that continued right throughout his life. So, of course, I can go on and, we can circle back to some of these questions. But maybe as a first question to Gretchen, could you take us into the studio? Because we've spoken about photography, out there, traveling, seeing, observing. But if you could share a bit about, what about how he actually used these photographs in the studio, and if there were any other references that he might have referred to.
It's hard for me to think back to actually seeing my father-in-law paint, because by the time I knew him, he was quite a little elderly and a little bit, dare I say, lazy. Okay, he enjoyed life. So no worries there. But he had a huge library, which is, many art books. He collected postcards as well. He was a highly visual person, and I think for him, photography was easy and painting was hard. So, he wasn't trying to, just mimic or copy the image. He was, he was using it to sort of inspire him to kind of create, I think what he wanted to create something new and something different. So, yes.
And it was interesting, you mentioned to me how he also kept the photographs. Could you talk a bit about how he categorized them as well?
The Bali photographs? Okay. So he had all these little, the envelopes were labeled, and some had place names. So you had Ubud or Basaki or whatever. And then you had an envelope titled temples. So to unpick that and to kind of identify all those temples, that was quite an amazing task. So he had another envelope, memorable portraits of the people that he met along the way. And there was one photograph, for example, that, it's a bunch of... It's 4 artists with an old man and like a high school student standing in a location that cannot be identified. It didn't go in the book. And then just a couple of nights ago, there was an event at the Indonesian embassy and talking about the trip and about Covarrubias in the auxiliary exhibition that's open now in National Library. And at the end, a woman came up to me and said, "I think you're talking about my grandfather." And sure enough, it turns out that it was her grandfather who hosted the 4 artists in Bandung. So we still have some historical facts to kind of uncover.
Yeah, I think that's the most exciting thing. I mean, for us at the National Gallery, where we are very privileged to actually have a lot of the related sketches and some artworks for the Bali trip. Working with Gretchen really helped us to refine actually some of the names. So I don't know if you want to share.
Yeah, should we share? We should share, because this is a little bit...
we can go back to...
the little bit I appended at the end, because I think you all will enjoy seeing this. So there were a lot of art, especially works on paper, that were completely unidentified. And so with Liu Kang's photographs, we could...
Next slide, please.
So here's Chen Chongsui's photo of a very important temple complex in Desai Kesaman, Denpasar. And then you can see his painting Bali Temple. So it's a specific place. Okay, that's one example. And here's Chen Chongsui's photo of, that's Nikata Renang, AKA Boss Lady, preparing the hair for the dancer. And then he did this painting. And of course, Chen Wenxi did this wonderful portrait of the boatman, highly imaginative, because you've seen, you saw the photograph. But hey, that's what art is all about, right? Okay, but the fun thing about this is the, some semblance. Okay, so this photograph was found in Liu Kang's study, and doesn't belong to him. Now, Liu Kang has Chen Chong-sui photographs, and he has other things he picked up. Who knows? Maybe, and he has some postcards. But this is a photograph. I thought maybe it was done by Chung Soo-ping, but I concluded it wasn't. But you can see how Chung Soo-ping was inspired by. He must have had a photograph like this to do his famous painting Balinese dance. And again, so the sketch is inspired by the dancer who posed for them at Nika Tut Ranong's with the same, that golden flower headdress. Okay, and then again I found this photo in Liu Kang's study. And Chung Soo-ping became famous for his portraits of two women after the Bali trip. And I was really quite stunned to see this photograph. And then you can look at all of his paintings, and it's just an interesting comparison. But now identification. So on the right you see a sketch which was hitherto unknown, but it is actually the Selecta swimming pool in Trets, Java. And then this is the Bogor Botanic Garden. So again, it was on caption, it was not known, but you can see the bridge here is the one that Chen Chong-sui is standing on. So these are just a few kind of, and finally, so what, you see this? So sometimes the more you look at the photographs, the more you actually see. Okay, so so this was very, very kind of towards the end of putting all the book together and everything, and oh my gosh, I think this must be this model. And sure enough, when you put them together, you can see, and that of course is Chung Soo-ping sketching.
Very, very, so it was really interesting for us to kind of go through that process of actually understanding that a lot of the artworks that we had simply kind of attributed to Bali in 1952 actually covered, in some cases, Javanese experiences and places. So, for example, the Selecta swimming pool, Bogor, or even Artist and Model, which in fact was not painted in Bali. Right, and it has this, and it's stayed with this painting, right? This assumption that this iconic artwork was painted in Bali, and it's kind of this encapsulation of the experience there, which brings me to, I guess, my next question, which is a bit more speculative. Thinking about how, Liu Kang was actually quite free in combining all these different references from photographs, sketches, the books and photo books that he had, and kind of combining them into final works, which was sometimes painted much later. I wanted to ask you about, your thoughts on memory, actually, in looking through Liu Kang's archive in particular, which is something you've been doing for many years. Because I think you mentioned to me, kind of briefly, that he sometimes misremembered things as well.
The older he got, the worse his memory became. So there are certain photographs, for example, and if the caption, I can tell the handwriting, he did it when he was older, I always have to kind of like, is this really the right date or the right, because he did forget. But there was one painting in particular that he somewhere had attributed to being done in China, but actually it was St. John's Fort in Malacca. But I found there's a sketch, there's a drawing, there's a photograph of the artwork with the original date, which is like 1948. And then, of course, the painting today has, 1937 as the date. So, it can be quite tricky. So he was a bit loose and free sometimes with all of this. But in old age. Okay, let's towards the end of his life.
And I think looking at how meticulous he actually was, right, in writing down all those captions which Gretchen shared with us earlier, I think he also had a sense of history, would you say?
Yeah, definitely. Oh, but let me just also clarify that many of his paintings have very detailed sketches. So obviously he worked out the composition before he actually painted them in the 1940s and the 50s and the 60s. So it wasn't like, just fly by night. Okay, so now what was your question?
What was my question? I can't remember. Okay, he'll come back to us.
Memory.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, just from this conversation, you can see how many, and just looking at the images, I mean, there are so many exciting routes that you could go down, even comparing the photography of Liu Kang and Chen Chongsui vis-a-vis their artworks could be so fruitful.
Yeah.
And we started to kind of do a small sliver of that in our Singapore gallery, where we've also kind of situated the 1952 trip and the subsequent exhibition within a much broader kind of thought space about regional travel and the interest of Singapore artists in regional travel in general.
One question that came to my mind is that, these artists, of course, when they went to Bali, they were young men, and they had their kind of their pioneering status was yet to be achieved, so to speak. And so as you get into the 80s when there's they have retrospectives at the first Singapore Art Gallery, which is in the old National Museum. There's a space dedicated, and they all have their one-man shows. And then subsequently, people like Sabapati start writing about Singapore art history and, really kind of delving into it. And, my father-in-law he outlived all the other artists, by the way. The first to pass away was the youngest, Chung Soo Ping, in the early 80s. And then Chen Chongsui and Chen Wen-si later. But my father-in-law lived them by a decade. So I was thinking, I wondered, why not in the 90s when people were like kind of very interested in this era and the Bali paintings, why didn't he kind of like look for these photographs? Did he really forget that he had them? That they just sat there for 70 years. It's really quite amazing.
Okay, so I'll ask Gretchen one more question, but after that I'll open to the floor, so maybe you can just have your questions in mind. So my final question to you, Gretchen, is a bit more personal. I guess to share with the audience, what surprised you most about going through the photographs?
I think it was the sheer quantity. Okay, out of the over 1,000 photographs, he took 100 of the reliefs at Borobudur, okay? But he never did anything with those pictures, okay? He was, I wondered why. What was he thinking? I mean, did he have a project in mind? Or, did he think he was going to write extensively, maybe for the Chinese newspapers, or who knows? But then in the end, I also thought perhaps, he just did it for the sheer pleasure. The sheer joy and pleasure of kind of looking through the lens. And, because any photographer in the room will know how addictive that can be. So I think it was the sheer number that surprised me the most. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Gretchen. Okay, so we have some time for a few questions. So you can raise your hands and my colleagues will come to you with a microphone.
Thank you so much, Gretchen, for such an informative presentation. I was just wondering if you had an insight into Liu Kang's perspective on women. So obviously he's painted women not only in Bali, but in many parts of Asia across different societies and different landscapes. And obviously they all seem to be quite strong and empowered. I'm just wondering if you had any insight.
Okay, well, that's actually a very interesting question.
Sure. Thank you.
Because, it's related in a way to how Western art came to China, in the early 20th century, and how art education was being professionalized in these small academies in Shanghai that were private academies opening up, and then teaching Western art. And the two main features of these academies and their teaching methodology was life drawing and outdoor sketching, au plein air. So Liu Kang was very young when he went to Shanghai, and so he was exposed. And this is, it was very controversial in the 20s, when they started to employ young women to pose nude for these art students, to draw. But what is the foundation of Western art, the traditional Western art? It's the human body. So he, from a very early age, was kind of exposed to this kind of European philosophy about the beauty of the human body, male and female. And I think that was very fixed in his outlook throughout his life, which is why he didn't shy away or hesitate, for example, for drawing or sketching, like doing life drawing, clothed or unclothed. It was, he had this notion that had been implanted when he was very young, that this is, part of artistic training. So yes, I don't know if that answers your question, but that might just illuminate a little bit, some of his drawings about women. Because, so I know when you look at them in the context of today, you think, oh, yeah. But when you understand his art education, where he came from, and that moment in time when China was, totally revamping its kind of aesthetic outlook, in a way, and he was very much part of that generation. So, yeah.
Another question?
Hi, thanks for sharing. I have a question about the many photos he took, which some of them look like selfies, which are quite a modern phenomenon. So my question is, was this common back then? Because when I look at how they look, their consciousness of the camera, how they pose, how they look into the lens, it looks, some of these photos look actually very contemporary and modern. So I was wondering how, is this typical back then, or was Liu Kang a man ahead of his time?
Oh, was it typical? That I cannot comment but I can, but I would say this, that bearing in mind that his purpose, probably in getting the camera in the first place and taking it to China, was so he could record his experiences for his family, especially his mother, who was illiterate. So how do you do that? Well, you set up a tripod and you take a picture of yourself in your bedroom and you're, out exploring the city. And that's, because you can't write a letter and say, oh, I went to see this, I went to see that. So it really was literally a visual diary especially for his mother. Yeah. So how rare, unusual, that I can't comment on. But yes, I agree with you. A lot of the photos do seem very modern, don't they? And the funny thing is that the photographs, the negatives that have lasted the best are those that are the oldest. So, the negatives from the 1920s and 30s, they're still, I've had them scanned and they're just amazing. Whereas, once with color film, whether it was slides or, Ektachrome, Kodachrome, all of this, the loss is, the deterioration is really very bad. Yeah.
I'm also curious, how did he finance his trips? Because I can imagine it cost quite a lot back then.
Well, are you referring to like the Bali trip?
And even when he was younger, I mean, he was staying in Paris.
Because his family did very well. Rubber took off. The price of rubber increased dramatically in the early 20th century with the arrival of automobiles and mass production of automobiles. And so, there were a lot of Singapore and in Malaya, there was a whole group of people that benefited by that. So in the 20s, the price of rubber was very, very high. And so they could afford to send him abroad. He was the oldest of, I think, 8 or 9 kids, but there was a big gap between him and the other siblings because he'd been conceived and then the dad went overseas to Malaya, and then, he and his mom followed 6 years later. But in one letter that he wrote to Liu Haisu in the early 30s, because Liu Haisu had already gone back to China, he said that it looks like they have to leave because his family can no longer support him. And that is because with the onset of the Great Depression in 1929, the price of rubber fell, and to such a point that, the family couldn't afford to keep him. And as for the Bali trip, the 4 artists had an exhibition together in 1951, which was the first time that the artists as kind of a group was sort of implanted as a group in the minds of, the Singapore community. And so it could have been that from the profits of that sale. But they did it on a shoestring. I mean, I'm sure it was the first time all of them flew on an airplane to Jakarta because they'd all come to Singapore by sea, and they probably saved up for it, and and they benefited from a lot of hospitality on their travels. They're very lucky but that's a whole nother story.
So I think we have time for just one more question. One more question, yeah. Maybe the gentleman here. Mr. Choi, we can have a chat after the lecture.
Sorry, Mr. Choi, you don't want to ask your question?
No, it's okay. You can go
Choi
ahead. Yeah.
afterwards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, thanks for the talk. When they returned, the exhibition was called Pictures from Bali. But with the sort of new curation, the exhibition, the book, it shows that actually it was a whole trip with Bali as focus. So the question is, do we still call this, everything about Bali? The book is Bali 1952. This talk is about Bali and beyond. But in actual fact, I think they were also fascinated by Borobudur,
Oh, yes.
come
Yeah.
around. So it's a question of curatorship. How do we see this, right? Because then we are just citing Bali over and over again.
Well, the way they saw it, because they forgot about Java pretty quickly. Okay? And even like okay.
Yeah, so I can help to take this question, which I thank you for, because I think it's something that has also, it's a perspective that has also evolved over time, and it's really through new research and speaking with the family, all the different artist families, that we've really come to this point where we can see this kind of idealization of Bali in a much broader context. And I agree that it is up to us, history is something that rewrites itself, with new research and new interpretations and new critical thinking. And I think it is important to acknowledge that for the artists, they were engaging with Bali in this very specific way. They went to Java, sure, and traveled across, but Bali was that key destination that they wanted to go to, and it was the place that they spent the longest time. And they were definitely in dialogue with the many artists that had been to Bali before. And I think it was very intentional that they then came back and called their exhibition Bali. So we have to acknowledge that that was something very unique that they wanted to express and engage with. Although obviously from a kind of more contemporary perspective, we can obviously make all these interesting commentaries and hopefully much more rich research into understanding the broader context, not just of Indonesia that they traveled, but why travel for artists in Singapore, not just these 4 artists, but subsequently the 10-man art group, many artists who travel across Malaya as well. Why travel was such an important tool in general for artists practicing in Southeast Asia and the region. Yeah. Anything final to add, Gretchen? Okay, so I think we'll have to draw the broader public discussion to a close, but we have time to engage with everyone after the discussion as well. So we also have a book signing right after this, so you can go out and get a copy of the book, and Gretchen will be around to engage with you and also perhaps sign your copies. And we'll also be putting a kind of code for a quick survey for today's lecture after this as well. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and also all the colleagues at National Gallery who have made this session possible today. So thank you so much.